The orbital bombardment of Antax Prime did not end the war. It only churned the mud into a killing field of industrial scale. The void shields of Hive City Tertius had collapsed 3 days prior, leaving the population of 40 million souls exposed to the hard vacuum of high-altitude artillery. The sky was no longer blue or grey. It was the colour of a bruise, purple and black with the smoke of burning promethium refineries. The Imperial Guard regiments stationed on the outer perimeter were not dying in a glorious last stand. They were dying because the Departamento Munitorum had routed their ammunition supplies to the wrong subsector. Men starved in the trenches while holding empty laser guns. The air smelled of wet rust, recycled air, and the copper tang of blood that never dried. This was the reality of the Imperium of man. It was a machine that fed on human meat to keep its gears turning, and the gears were rusted shut. In the southern quadrant of the defensive line, the Antaxian 5th Rifles were breaking. Their morale had shattered when the enemy artillery began using shells tipped with warp screamers, devices that emitted a psychic noise that turned sleep into a coma of nightmares. The men were weeping in the mud. The commissars were shooting the weeping men to encourage the others. It was a cycle of waste that made no tactical sense. Jack Krauser watched the execution of a young sergeant through the rain-slicked visor of his distinct tactical headset. He did not flinch. He did not feel pity. He felt disgusted by the inefficiency. Krauser sat on a crate of expired ration packs, sharpening a combat knife that was too large for a standard guardsman and too small for an Astartes. The metal was dark, folded steel, older than the regiment itself. Krauser was not a native of Antax. He was a specialist, a mercenary advisor, contracted by the planetary governor to train the elite PDF stormtroopers. That contract was void now. The governor was dead, his palace a crater. Krauser remained because there was nowhere else to go. The blockade in orbit meant no ships left the surface. He looked to the commissar, a man named Valerius, who wore a pristine black coat despite the filth of the trench. Valerius shouted about duty to the God Emperor while putting a bolt round through the head of a soldier who had dropped his rifle from exhaustion. Krauser spat into the mud. He respected strength. He respected order. But this was not order. This was the flailing panic of a dying animal. The Imperium demanded loyalty, but it offered no power in return. It demanded sacrifice, but gave no victory. Krauser ran a hand over his left arm, which was wrapped heavily in thick, oil-stained bandages from shoulder to wrist. The limb throbbed with a dull, heavy heat. It wanted to be free of the cloth. It wanted to work. A whistle blew across the line. It was not the whistle of relief. It was the signal for a countercharge. The command staff had ordered a push across 2 kilometers of open ground, straight into the teeth of the enemy fortifications. The enemy was not a rebel militia. The enemy was the blood-packed, highly disciplined warriors devoted to the Chaos God Khorne. To charge them across open ground was suicide. Krauser stood up. He sheathed the knife. He checked the action on his compound bow, a weapon that looked archaic to the laser gun-wielding soldiers, but fired explosive-tipped shafts capable of piercing ceramite. He did not intend to die here for a corpse on a golden throne. He intended to survive. And to survive, he would have to kill better than everyone else. The bombardment shifted, walking its fire toward their trench. The ground shook, dislodging dirt from the trench walls. The screaming started again. The war had only just begun to notice him. The staging area for the counter-offensive was a graveyard of tanks. Several Laman Russ battle tanks sat bogged down in the slurry, their treads snapped by anti-tank mines. Crews worked frantically to repair them. but the machine spirits of the vehicles were sullen and unresponsive. Tech priests chanted binary rites, swinging censers of incense. But incense did not fix broken drivetrains. Krauser walked through the chaos with a stride that measured the ground perfectly. He did not run. He moved with an economy of motion that made the frantic guardsmen look like children. He wore a heavy flak vest, customized with extra plating he had scavenged from fallen stormtroopers. His face was scarred, a roadmap of violence from wars on a dozen worlds. His eyes were cold, assessing threats and assets in a constant loop. He approached the command bunker, where Colonel Halloway was screaming into a voxcaster. Halloway was a noble-born officer who had bought his commission. He understood parades, not sieges. The colonel looked up, sweat cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He saw the mercenary and sneered. To the Imperial officer, Krauser was a necessary evil, a paid killer who lacked the holy discipline of the Guard. The colonel pointed at the tactical map. He explained the plan. It was simple. The first wave would advance under smoke cover. They would draw the enemy fire. The second wave, including the few remaining tanks, would punch through the center. It was a meat grinder strategy. Krauser looked at the map. He pointed to the ridgeline on the eastern flank. He explained that the enemy had heavy bolter emplacements there. He explained that the smoke would clear in the high winds within minutes. He explained that the first wave would be cut down before they reached the halfway mark. The colonel slammed his fist on the table. He cited the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer. He spoke of faith. He said the Emperor protects the bold. He accused Krauser of cowardice. Krauser did not argue. He had seen this conversation 100 times. Weak men used faith as a shield to hide their incompetence. He turned and left the bunker. He would not lead the first wave. He would position himself on the flank, in the ruins of a manufactorum, and wait for the inevitable collapse. Then he would act. The attack began at 0600 hours. 3,000 men went over the top of the trenches. They shouted the name of the Emperor. For 10 seconds it looked magnificent. Then the Blood Pact opened fire. The sound was a continuous tear in the atmosphere. Heavy bolters, autocannons, and laser fire created a wall of death. The front rank of the Imperial Guard evaporated. It was not a battle. It was an industrial disposal of biomass. Krauser watched from the shadows of a ruined cooling tower on the eastern flank. He had detached himself from the main force, slipping away during the confusion of the assembly. He held his bow, and arrow nocked. He was not hiding. He was hunting. He saw a squad of blood-packed troopers moving up a drainage trench to flank the pinned Imperial forces. These were not mindless cultists. They moved with professional spacing. They wore crimson armor and grotesque iron masks. They carried chain axes and lascarbines. They were soldiers who had found a new patron. Krauser waited until the point man was 20 meters away. He released the string. The bow made no sound, only a sharp hiss. The arrow took the point man in the throat. The explosive tip detonated a fraction of a second later, severing the head in a spray of red mist. The rest of the squad halted, dropping into cover instantly. They scanned the ruins. They were good. Krauser was better. He dropped from the gantry, landing in the mud with a heavy thud. He did not seek cover. He charged. The closest enemy soldier raised a lascarbine. Krauser sidestepped the beam, a movement so fast it blurred the eye. He closed the distance and drove his knife through the gap in the soldier's armor, piercing the heart. He twisted the blade and ripped it free. The remaining 4 soldiers engaged him. They dropped their guns and drew blades. This was their religion. Khorne demanded blood, and they preferred to spill it up close. Krauser smiled. It was a grim, tight expression. This was honest. This was pure. He parried a chain axe swing with his own combat knife, the sparks showering his face. The force of the blow would have shattered a normal man's wrist. Krauser's arm held firm. He kicked the attacker in the knee, shattering the joint backwards. The man fell without screaming, just a grunt of rage. Krauser finished him with a stomp to the neck. The fight lasted 30 seconds. 6 enemies lay dead. Krauser stood panting, the adrenaline flooding his system. It felt good. It felt right. He looked at the carnage. He looked at the efficiency of the kill. But the main battle was being lost. The Imperial Center had collapsed. The Colonel's tank was burning. The survivors were retreating, and the retreat was turning into a rout. Krauser knew the doctrine of the enemy. They would not stop. They would pursue. They would butcher every living thing in the trench line to summon their demons. He had to make a choice. He could retreat to the rear lines, find a transport, and try to escape the planet. Or he could hold this flank. If the flank fell, the enemy would encircle the entire regiment, and there would be no rear lines to retreat to. He looked at his bandaged left arm. The pain was sharp now. It was a demanding pain. It pulsed in time with the artillery. He heard a sound behind him. He spun around, knife raised. It was a squad of Imperial stormtroopers, the remnants of the unit he was supposed to train. They were bloodied, their armor cracked. The sergeant, a woman named Vance, looked at Krauser. She saw the dead blood-packed soldiers. She saw the lack of fear. She asked for orders. Krauser looked at them. They were battered, but they were elite. They were tools he could use. He told them to set up a kill zone in the ruins. He told them they were going to bleed the enemy dry. The afternoon brought a change in the enemy tactics. They stopped shelling and sent in the armor. Specifically, they sent a defiler. The diamond engine scuttled over the corpse-choked mud on 6 crab-like legs. It was a massive construct of brass and iron, possessed by a rage-filled spirit from the warp. Its battle cannon blew apart the bunkers. Its Reaper autocannon shredded the infantry. It was heading straight for Krauser's position in the Manufactorum ruins. Sergeant Vance fired a crack grenade from her launcher. It hit the defiler's leg armor and detonated, blackening the metal but doing no structural damage. The machine turned its turret toward them. A heavy flamer washed the lower ruins in liquid fire. 2 of the stormtroopers screamed as they burned. Krauser knew they had no anti-armor weapons left. The logical, tactical decision was to withdraw. But the rage was rising in him. It was a cold, hard knot in his chest. He hated being weak. He hated being outgunned. He looked at the machine. It was powerful. It was perfect in its lethality. He dropped his bow. He dropped his knife. He reached up and grabbed the bandages on his left arm. "Sergeant," Krauser said. His voice was low, guttural. "Get back." Vance looked at him, confused. "Sir?" Krauser ripped the bandages away. The arm underneath was not human. It was a mass of dark, hardened muscle and chitinous plating. It pulsed with a reddish glow. The fingers were long, tipped with talons that looked like obsidian. It was a mutation, a gift from a bioweapon exposure years ago, in a different sector, something the Inquisition would burn him for on sight. He had kept it hidden. He had kept it controlled, but he needed power now. The defiler smashed through the wall of the ruin, debris raining down. It loomed over Krauser, its mechanical claws clicking. Krauser roared. It was not a scream of fear. It was a challenge. The mutation surged. The flesh of his arm expanded, twisting, hardening into a massive, blade-like shield structure. It was the Las Plagas strain adapted to the 41st Millennium, fed by the ambient warp energy of the battlefield. The defiler struck. Its claw, capable of shearing through a tank, slammed into Krauser. He caught it. The impact drove Krauser's feet into the concrete floor, cracking the foundation. His mutated arm held the mechanical limb in a deadlock. The muscles bulged, tearing his flak vest. The sheer physical impossibility of a human holding back a demon engine stunned the stormtroopers. Krauser gritted his teeth. Blood ran from his nose. "Witness," he growled. With a heave that tore the ligaments in his shoulder, Krauser shoved the defiler's limb back. He leaped, the mutated arm shifting, the blades extending into a long, organic spear. He drove the weapon into the joint of the defiler's leg, where the armor was thinnest. He felt the resistance of metal, and then the sickening give of wet machinery. He tore the leg loose. The demon engine shrieked, a sound of grinding gears and psychic pain. It collapsed on one side. Krauser did not stop. He climbed the chassis, dodging the thrashing limbs. He reached the turret block. He drove his mutated fist through the vision slit, crushing the sensors, ripping at the internal cabling. He was destroying the machine with his bare hands. The defiler shuddered and died, its demon spirit banished back to the warp. Krauser stood on top of the wreckage. He breathed heavily. The mutation began to recede, the giant blade shrinking back into a scarred, heavy arm. He looked down. Sergeant Vance and the surviving stormtroopers were staring at him. Their weapons were lowered. They were not looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him with horror. In the Imperium, the mutant is the enemy. The mutant is unclean. Krauser wiped the oil and blood from his face. He understood. He had saved them, but he had doomed himself. "Monster," one of the troopers whispered. He raised his laser gun. Krauser looked at the trooper. He felt no betrayal. He expected this. It was the rule of the world. The weak fear the strong. "Put it down," Vance ordered, her voice shaking. "He killed the machine." "He's a heretic," the trooper insisted, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Look at him." Krauser did not wait for the debate to end. He drew his combat knife with his right hand. He threw it. The knife took the trooper in the eye. He dropped instantly. The other three troopers raised their weapons. Krauser jumped from the wreck, moving with that supernatural speed again. He did not use the mutated arm. He used his boots and his fists. He broke the neck of the second trooper. He kicked the third into a wall, collapsing his chest. Vance was the last one standing. She had not raised her weapon. She stood frozen. Krauser stopped. He picked up his knife from the dead man's skull. He wiped it on the dead man's uniform. "You have a choice, Sergeant," Krauser said. "You can report this, or you can walk away." Vance looked at her dead squad. She looked at the destroyed defiler. She looked at Krauser's eyes. They were yellow now, glowing faintly in the gloom. "They will hunt you," she said. "Let them," Krauser replied. Vance turned and ran. She ran back toward the Imperial lines. She would report him. The commissars would come. The Inquisition would come. Krauser watched her go. He retrieved his bow. He wrapped his arm back in the tattered remains of the bandages, though the cloth could barely contain the heat radiating from the limb now. He was alone. The Imperial Guard was his enemy. The Blood Pact was his enemy. He checked his supplies. He had 3 ration bars. He had 12 arrows. He had his knife. And he had a new feeling in the back of his mind. It was a low, distant drumbeat. It sounded like a heart beating, but the heart was the size of a planet. "Blood," the voice whispered. "Not a command. A statement of fact. Blood is the currency." Krauser looked at the carnage around the defiler. He had killed the machine not with tactics, but with rage and biological supremacy. He began walking. Not toward the Imperial lines, not toward the spaceport. He walked deeper into the ruins, toward the territory held by the Chaos forces. He needed weapons. He needed better armor. He needed to find the commander of the blood-packed force. If he was going to be hunted, he would become the apex predator. Night fell over Antax Prime. The temperature dropped, freezing the mud. Krauser found shelter in the basement of a bombed-out administratum building. He needed to rest. His body burned calories at an accelerated rate when he used the mutation. He ate the 3 ration bars in one sitting. It wasn't enough. He felt a hunger that food could not satisfy. He sat in the dark, listening to the patrols passing overhead. He thought about his past, the crash, the experiments, the government that used him and discarded him. It was the same story here, just on a galactic scale. The Emperor was just another distant bureaucrat. The High Lords of Terror were just another committee of liars. He clenched his left hand. The power was real. The power was the only thing that didn't lie. A sound at the entrance of the basement. Krauser did not move. He controlled his breathing. A figure stepped into the room. It was huge, filling the doorway. It wore the spiked crimson power armor of a World Eater, a Chaos Space Marine. The warrior did not have a helmet. His face was a ruin of scar tissue and metal implants. The butcher's nails, ancient cortical implants, buzzed audibly in his skull, driving him to madness. The World Eater sniffed the air. He smelled the blood on Krauser. He smelled the mutation. "Little meat," the giant rumbled. His voice was like grinding stones. "You smell wrong." Krauser stood up. He was 6 feet tall, a large man. The World Eater towered over him at 8 feet, encased in ceramite. "I am not meat," Krauser said. The World Eater laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. He revved his chain axe. The teeth spun, hungry for flesh. "Khorne cares not," the giant said. "Skull is skull." He charged. The space in the basement was tight. The Space Marine was fast, faster than anything Krauser had fought before. The axe swung in a decapitating arc. Krauser ducked. The axe shattered a concrete pillar behind him. The dust blinded them for a moment. Krauser knew he could not block this. He could not grapple this. This was an Astartes, a biological killing machine created for the sole purpose of war. He needed to be smarter. Krauser rolled between the giant's legs. He slashed his knife at the back of the knee joint, the soft armor. The blade skidded off. The armor was too thick. The World Eater turned, backhanding Krauser. The blow connected. Krauser flew across the room and smashed into the wall. He felt ribs crack. His vision swam. The giant approached, raising the axe for the killing blow. "Weak," the World Eater spat. Krauser looked up. He spat blood. "Not weak," he wheezed. He focused on the pain. He focused on the anger. He focused on the drumbeat in his head. "Kill him," the voice said. Louder this time. Krauser unleashed the arm. No bandages this time. He let it fully manifest. The flesh tore his jacket apart. The limb grew massive, the blades forming a wicked organic pincer. The World Eater paused. He looked at the mutation. He did not look disgusted. He looked interested. "Xenos filth?" the giant asked. "Power," Krauser answered. Krauser lunged. He did not aim for the armor. He aimed for the face. The World Eater swung the axe. Krauser caught the haft of the weapon with his mutated claw. The chain teeth chewed into his chitinous flesh, spraying black ichor, but the bone held. Krauser roared, ignoring the pain, and pulled the giant closer. With his human hand, he drove his combat knife into the World Eater's exposed neck, right above the gorget. The blade sank in. The giant gurgled. But Astartes do not die easily. The giant headbutted Krauser, shattering Krauser's nose. The giant dropped the axe and grabbed Krauser's throat. They grappled in the dark, a monster of science and a monster of the warp. Krauser's vision was fading. The grip was crushing his windpipe. He had one move left, the mutation. He concentrated all the biomass into the tip of his mutated limb. He turned it into a spike. He drove it through the Space Marine's chest plate. It took everything he had. The chitin cracked. The muscle tore. But the spike punched through the ceramite, through the black carapace, and into the primary heart. The World Eater froze. The light went out of his eyes. The grip loosened. The giant fell. Krauser collapsed on top of him. He lay there for a long time, breathing in the stench of the dead demigod. He had killed an angel of death. He pulled himself up. He was broken. His ribs, his nose, his throat. He needed time to heal. He looked at the dead World Eater. He looked at the chain axe lying on the floor. He picked it up. It was heavy, designed for transhuman muscles. Krauser had to use 2 hands to lift it effectively. He looked at the armor. He began to strip the corpse. He took the pauldrons. He took the gauntlets. They were too big, but he could modify them. He could make them fit. He sat on the chest of the dead Marine and began to work on the armor straps. The drumbeat in his head was a thunder now. "Good," the voice said. Krauser paused. He looked at the ceiling. "I do this for me," he said to the empty room. "Not for you." The silence that followed was heavy. The voice did not argue. The voice knew better. Krauser finished strapping the crimson gauntlet to his right arm. It was a mismatch of scavenged gear and stolen power. He was no longer a mercenary advisor. He was a warlord in the making. He walked out of the basement. The sun was rising. The light was red, filtered through the smoke. He had a war to win. And for the first time since he arrived in this hellish galaxy, he felt at home. The war for Antax Prime did not stop for one man, but the nature of the war in Sector 4 changed because of him. For 3 weeks, following the destruction of the Defiler, the Eastern Industrial District became a silent zone. Imperial patrols that entered the ruins of the Manufactorum District did not return. They did not report contact. They simply vanished. The Vox channels filled with static and the occasional wet sound of tearing metal. Jack Krauser lived in the skeleton of the city. He had ceased to be a soldier in the traditional sense. He had become an environmental hazard. The survival instincts that had kept him alive in the jungles of South America and the islands of isolated cults were now operating at maximum efficiency. He did not sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. His metabolism, altered by the symbioses of the Las Plagas parasite and the ambient warp saturation of the planet, had stripped the fat from his body and replaced it with dense, corded muscle that felt like steel cable under his skin. He wore the spoils of his kill. The crimson gauntlets of the World Eater were locked onto his forearms, the servos rewired by intuition and trial and error to respond to his nerve impulses. He wore the pauldron on his right shoulder, a heavy slab of ceramite that threw off his balance until he learned to move with the weight. The chain axe, a weapon named Gore Drinker by its previous owner, was strapped to his back when not in use. It was heavy, brutal, and loud. Krauser preferred his knife and his bow for the stalk, saving the axe for the finish. He was hunting, but he was also being hunted. The Imperium is a slow beast, but it is vindictive. The reports of a mutant traitor in Sector 4 had reached the ears of Interrogator Harlan, an agent of the Ordo Hereticus, attached to the planetary command. Harlan did not care about the strategic map. He cared about purity. He had requisitioned a squad of Kassakin stormtroopers, the very best of the Cadian shock troops, to liquidate the target. Krauser watched them from the 40th floor of a bombed-out hab block. He saw them move through the street below. They were professional. They checked corners. They covered arcs. They had Auspex scanners that could detect heat and motion. Krauser checked his own heat signature. The mutation in his left arm ran hot, a furnace of biological energy. He had learned to mask it by pressing the limb against the cold plasteel of the building's infrastructure, dissipating the heat into the architecture. He did not engage them in the street. That was their kill zone. He waited until they entered the structure. He wanted them close. The Kashyyykin swept the lower floors. Krauser moved through the elevator shafts, descending silently. He was not just killing them. He was studying them. He needed their supplies. He needed their comms. The point man of the Kashyyykin squad triggered a tripwire on the 10th floor. It was not an explosive. It was a noise lure, a simple can of bolts falling on a sheet of metal. The squad spun, laser guns raised. Discipline perfect. In that second of distraction, Krauser dropped from the ceiling hatch behind the rear guard. He did not use the mutation. He used the combat knife. He drove the blade into the gap between the stormtrooper's helmet and gorget. He severed the spinal cord and lowered the body silently. He took the man's hell gun and grenades before fading back into the shadows. The squad realized that they were down a man 10 seconds later. The sergeant barked orders. They went into a defensive perimeter. Target is close. The interrogator's voice crackled over the squad channel, which Krauser was now monitoring via the dead man's vox bead. Suffering is the coin of the Emperor. Spend it. Krauser smiled in the dark. He primed a crack grenade. He did not throw it at the squad. He threw it at the load-bearing pillar next to them. The explosion brought the ceiling down. Concrete and rebar rained on the elite soldiers. Dust filled the corridor. Now, Krauser moved. The mutation surged, his left arm expanding, the chitinous blades ripping through his sleeve. He was a blur of violence. He decapitated the first soldier with a sweep of the mutated limb. He shot the second in the face with the stolen hell gun, the high-powered laser punching through the carapace helmet. The sergeant turned, his power sword igniting with a crackle of energy. He was fast. He slashed at Krauser, burning a line across Krauser's chest plate. Krauser didn't back down. He dropped the gun. He caught the sergeant's wrist with his human hand, the World-Eater gauntlet crushing the bones of the Imperial officer. With his left, mutated arm, he impaled the sergeant through the torso, lifting him off the ground. Interrogator Harlan stood at the end of the hall. He held a bolt pistol. He fired. The rounds hit Krauser. One shattered his right shoulder pauldron. Another blew a chunk of meat from his thigh. Krauser did not stop. He did not feel pain in the way a human feels pain. He felt it as information. Damage registered. Mobility reduced 10%. Adrenaline compensation active. He threw the dying sergeant at the interrogator. Harlan dodged, but the moment cost him. Krauser was on him. He slammed the interrogator into the wall. The bolt pistol clattered away. Harlan looked into Krauser's eyes. He saw the yellow glow. He saw the vertical pupils. Heretic, Harlan spat. Demon. Soldier, Krauser corrected. He crushed the interrogator's skull against the wall. The silence returned. Krauser stood amidst the bodies of the Imperium's best. He was bleeding from 3 wounds. He breathed heavily, the air rattling in his chest. He looted the bodies. He took the power sword. He took the medical kits. He took the ration packs. He found a tactical data slate on the interrogator's belt. He hacked the biometric lock, bypassing the security with a brute force algorithm he had learned in his mercenary days. The map displayed the Imperial lines, but it also displayed the Chaos dispositions. The Blood Pact had established a forward operating base in the old subway tunnels beneath Sector 4. They were planning a push toward the planetary fusion reactor. Krauser looked at his mutated arm. The blades retracted, shifting back into the scarred, heavy limb. He needed an army. He could not fight the planet alone. The Imperium wanted him dead. The Chaos forces would want him dead too, unless he proved he was stronger. He headed for the subway. The underground was a nightmare of flickering lights and graffiti written in blood. The blood-packed camp was a scene of disciplined horror. These were not raving madmen. They were soldiers who worshipped the god of murder. They cleaned their weapons. They sparred. They carved runes into their flesh. Krauser walked into the main tunnel. He made no attempt at stealth. He dragged the heavy chain axe behind him, the metal screeching on the railway ties. The sentries raised their weapons. Krauser stopped. He threw the severed head of the Imperial interrogator at their feet. "I want to see your chieftain," Krauser said. The sentries looked at the head. They looked at the World Eater armor pieces Krauser wore. They lowered their guns. In the logic of Khorne, carrying the gear of a champion meant you had killed a champion. That commanded respect. They led him to the central platform. The chieftain was a man named Khorne. He was massive. His skin dyed red, his teeth replaced with iron fangs. He sat on a throne made of ammo crates. "You wear the armor of the Twettator Legion," Khorne rumbled. "Did you find it, or did you take it?" "I took it," Krauser said. "Then you claim the kill. I claim the power." Khorne stood up. He picked up a massive two-handed hammer. "The blood god demands proof." The circle formed. 200 blood-packed soldiers watched. This was the law of the tribe. Khorne swung the hammer. It was a clumsy, powerful blow. Krauser sidestepped. He was faster, but he was tired. The wounds from the Kashyyyk fight were slowing him down. Krauser drew his combat knife. He didn't use the axe. He wanted to humiliate the chieftain. He wanted to show skill. He danced around the hammer blows. He cut Khorne's arms. He cut his legs. He was bleeding the chieftain by 1,000 cuts. Khorne roared in frustration. He dropped the hammer and charged, trying to grapple. This was a mistake. Krauser dropped the knife. He triggered the mutation. The left arm exploded into the massive blade-like shield. He slammed it into Khorne's chest. The impact broke the chieftain's ribs. Krauser extended the organic spear, driving it through Khorne's stomach. He didn't kill him instantly. He lifted him up. "You fight like a child," Krauser whispered. "You waste energy. You waste movement." He ripped the arm free. Khorne fell, gasping, dying. Krauser looked at the crowd. "Who is next?" No one stepped forward. "Then listen," Krauser said. His voice carried through the tunnel. "You are dying for nothing. You charge guns like animals. You die to make noise." He pointed to the surface. "I will teach you how to kill. I will teach you how to win." The blood-packed soldiers knelt. They did not kneel out of love. They knelt because a bigger predator had entered the cave. The first catastrophe began 3 days later. Krauser had reorganized the warband. He had stopped the ritual scarification sessions and replaced them with fire and maneuver drills. He had executed 3 sub-commanders, refused to use cover. The rest fell in line. The target was the fusion reactor control station. If they took it, they could cut power to the Hive City's void shields. But the Imperium had realized the threat. Colonel Holloway, terrified of the reports coming from Sector 4, had authorized a desperate measure. He could not retake the sector, so he would erase it. The Imperial artillery batteries, positioned 10 miles away, loaded seismic buster shells. These were outlawed munitions designed to crack tectonic plates. Krauser was leading his new warband through the ruins when the sky turned white. The first shell hit the dam, holding back the toxic reservoir of the upper industrial zone. The sound was not a boom. It was a crack that was felt in the teeth. The ferrocrete wall, a mile high, disintegrated. Billions of gallons of radioactive sludge, heavy water, and industrial waste were unleashed. The wave was 500 feet high. It smashed through the lower hive. It drowned the loyalist trenches. It drowned the blood-packed rear guard. Krauser saw it coming. He was on the high ground of a maglev track. "Move!" he screamed at his men. "High ground, now!" They ran. For the first time, the Khornate cultists ran, not to engage, but to survive. The wave hit the foundations of the maglev. The metal groaned. The city below ceased to exist. It became a churning ocean of poison. Krauser watched as the floodwaters swallowed the Imperial Forward Command Post. He watched as the tanks were tossed like toys. The catastrophe was absolute. The battlefield was gone. But as the waters settled, a new landscape emerged. The toxic sludge had created a moat, cutting off the hive city from its supply lines, and the only land bridge left standing was the wreckage of the maglev line where Krauser stood. He was alive. He had 100 highly trained killers, and he held the only road into the enemy city. The voices in his head were screaming in delight. The death toll was in the millions. The psychic feedback was intense. Krauser felt his left arm pulsing, the mutation itching to grow, to consume him. He looked at his hand. The skin was turning grey, hard, like stone. "Not yet," he muttered. He looked at his warband. They were staring at the destruction with religious awe. They thought he had summoned the flood. They thought he was a prophet. "The road is open," Krauser said. "We march." He did not know it, but he had just broken the stalemate of Antax Prime. He had turned a siege into a slaughter, and the galaxy was beginning to watch. The strategic reality of Antax Prime had shifted from a war of attrition to a war of rapid collapse. The destruction of the dam and the subsequent flooding of the southern hemisphere had created a kill box geography that no Imperial manual had a contingency for. The hive city, Tertius, was now an island in a sea of toxic sludge, connected to the mainland only by the twisted spine of the maglev rail network and a series of unstable debris fields. Jack Krauser sat on the hood of a captured Chimera transport, watching his warband prepare. They were different now. They had scavenged Imperial flak armor, painting it blood red and black. They had lashed jagged metal plates to their vehicles, but most importantly, they were checking their fields of fire. The Scarred Hand, as they had started calling themselves, was an anomaly in the forces of chaos. They did not scream. They did not charge blindly. They moved with the silent, terrifying coordination of a special forces unit, but with the brutality of madmen. Krauser had taught them the concept of the L-shaped ambush. He had taught them effective range. He had taught them that a dead enemy cannot be offered to Khorne Citadel, but a dying enemy creates fear. And fear was a weapon. The chain reaction began with a logistical error. The Imperial forces in the Hive Tertius were starving. The flood had destroyed their food stockpiles. The only way to resupply was via high-altitude drops or heavy lifters coming from the northern spaceport. Krauser knew this. He had the tactical data slate. He knew the flight paths. He did not attack the hive. He attacked the spaceport's fuel depot, 60 miles to the north. It was a raid that should have been impossible. The spaceport was guarded by the Skitarii, the cybernetic soldiers of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They did not feel fear. They were linked by a noospheric data grid that allowed them to share target data instantly. Krauser drove his column of stolen vehicles through the toxic sludge, using the hazardous terrain that the Imperials deemed impassable. The Las Plagas mutation allowed him to sense the biological and warp-tainted currents in the waste, guiding him through the safest paths. They hit the fuel depot at night. The Skitarii Rangers on the perimeter saw heat signatures. They calculated firing solutions. Their galvanic rifles barked, sending hyper-velocity bullets toward the attackers. But the attackers did not charge. They popped smoke. Thick, chemically laced smoke that obscured thermal optics. From the smoke, Krauser's heavy weapons teams opened fire. They used autocannons and missile launchers, targeting the sensor towers first. It was a blinding strike. Krauser led the assault team. He moved through the smoke like a wraith. The Skitarii logic engines could not predict him. He was too fast, too erratic. A Sicarian Ruststalker, a multi-limbed assassin droid, lunged at him from the darkness. It moved with a blurring speed, its transonic blades humming. Krauser parried the strike with the flat of his chain axe. The force vibrated through his bones. The machine was faster than a human. But Krauser was not just human. He ducked a second swipe and unleashed the mutation. The organic spear shot out not to stab, but to hook. He caught the Ruststalker's leg. He yanked the cyborg off balance. With a roar, Krauser brought the chain axe down. The teeth chewed through the brass and ceramite on the machine's torso. Oil and white fluid sprayed. Silence the grid, Krauser ordered his men. His tech adepts, heretics he had liberated from a prison transport, jammed the Skitarii local control node. The coordinated defense of the Mechanicus fragmented into individual firefights, and in individual firefights, Krauser's berserkers, disciplined by his training, were superior. They took the depot in 2 hours. They did not hold it. Krauser ordered the fuel lines reversed. He ordered the pressure valves destroyed. He flooded the spaceport's landing pads with millions of gallons of promethium. Then he fired a single flare. The resulting inferno was visible from orbit. The spaceport was gutted. The heavy lifters burned on the tarmac. The chain reaction was immediate. Hive Tertius was now cut off from food and ammo. The defenders' morale plummeted. But the victory drew a new kind of attention. In the high orbit of Antax Prime, aboard the battle barge Red Tear, a Chaos Lord of the World Eaters watched the tactical hololith. His name was Lord Korgos. He was a veteran of the Long War, a being of immense power and cruelty. He saw the burning spaceport. He saw the unit markers of the scarred hand. "This is not the work of the Blood Pact," Korgos growled. "This is tactical." "A new champion, my lord," a sorcerer whispered. "A mortal. He fights with the cunning of the Alpha Legion, but the fury of the Fourth Tooth." Korgos narrowed his eyes. "He steals my glory. He steals my kills." Korgos ordered his personal retinue, the Red Butchers, to prepare for drop. He would not congratulate this upstart. He would kill him and take his skull. On the ground, Krauser felt the shift. The drumbeat in his head changed rhythm. It wasn't just blood anymore. It was challenge. He was standing in the ruins of the fuel depot when the drop pods rained down. They were not Imperial pods. They were Dreadclaws, spiked and burning with atmospheric entry heat. They slammed into the earth a mile from Krauser's position. Astartes, his second in command, a scarred sergeant named Vess, said with fear in his voice, "The World Eaters are here." "Good," Krauser said. He checked the edge on his chain axe. "We need better armor." But the strategic situation had spiraled out of control. The destruction of the spaceport meant the Imperial Guard in the north had to redeploy to protect their remaining supply lines. This left the central front weak. The main Chaos host, a horde of millions of cultists and mutants, surged through the gap Krauser had created. The Imperial line shattered. Krauser was no longer fighting a guerrilla war. He was in the middle of a total collapse. He rallied his men. "We are leaving," Leaving? Vess asked. The hive is ready to fall. The World Eaters will take the hive, Krauser said, and they will kill anything in their way, including us. We are going to the Mechanicus vault. Krauser had a plan. He had seen the maps. Beneath the fuel depot was a secure facility, a vault of archaeotech that the tech priests had been guarding. If the World Eaters wanted a fight, he would give them one, but he would do it on his terms. They descended into the understructure of the depot. The heat was intense. The fires above were turning the bunker into an oven. Krauser's mutation was reacting to the stress. The flesh on his chest was hardening, forming a natural carapace. He could feel the Plaga intelligence merging with his own. It wasn't a separate voice anymore. It was his intuition. It told him where the enemy was. They reached the vault door. It was a massive slab of adamantium sealed with gene logs. Open it, Krauser told his heretics. As they worked, the heavy thud of armored boots echoed down the corridor. Lord Khorne had arrived. He came alone, leaving his butchers to slaughter the rear guard. Khorne was a Terminator-armored Leviathan. He carried a pair of lightning claws that crackled with blue energy. You, Khorne boomed. His helmet grill amplified his voice to a deafening volume. The thief. Krauser turned. He looked small compared to the Terminator. I am the winner, Krauser said. Khorne laughed. He charged. The hallway was too narrow for him to move freely, but he was a tank. He smashed through the pipes and supports. Krauser ordered his men to fire. Bolters and autoguns raked the Terminator armor. The rounds sparked and detonated, but Khorne didn't slow down. Krauser knew he couldn't win a direct trade. The lightning claws would shred him at the molecular level. He looked at the vault door. The heretics were panicking. It won't open, one screamed. Krauser looked at the ceiling. The fuel pipes. He grabbed a melter bomb from his belt. Fire in the hole. He threw the bomb not at Khorne, but at the ceiling above the Chaos Lord. The explosion ruptured the main feed line for the depot above. Burning promethium, pressurized and white-hot, poured down in a waterfall of fire. It engulfed Khorne. The Terminator armor was sealed, proof against vacuum and heat, but the sheer force of the liquid fire knocked the giant down. The sensors were blinded. The servos overheated. Krauser didn't wait. He turned to the vault door. He placed his mutated hand on the gene lock. He focused. The Las Plagas was a biological shapeshifter. He forced the flesh to flow into the keyhole, to read the tumblers, to mimic the biological key. It was agony. It felt like burning his hand off. The lock clicked. The door groaned open. Krauser and his surviving men spilled inside. He hit the seal button. The blast door slammed shut just as Khorne rose from the fire, screaming a vow of eternal vengeance. Inside the vault, the air was cool and sterile. Stasis fields hummed. Krauser looked around. Rows of weapons, ancient plasma cells, and in the center, a vehicle. It was a Shadowsword, super heavy tank, an ancient pattern, likely dating back to the Great Crusade. It was a Titan killer. Krauser walked up to the massive machine. He ran his hand over the cold metal. He was trapped underground. A Chaos Lord was outside the door. The planet was burning. But he had a tank that could kill a god. He climbed onto the hull. Wake it up, he ordered. The strategic chain reaction was complete. Krauser had not just disrupted the war. He had escalated it to a level that would draw the eyes of the High Lords of Terror. He was no longer a variable. He was the equation. He sat in the commander's cupola. He felt the machine spirit of the Shadowsword stir. It was angry. It had been asleep for too long. Me too, Krauser whispered. He connected his neural interface to the tank's systems. The mutation interfaced with the machine. He felt the volcano cannon, as if it were his own arm. The war for Antax Prime was over. The war for Jack Krauser's soul had just begun. The Shadowsword was not merely a vehicle. It was a cathedral of war, dedicated to the theology of unmaking. Within the sealed environment of the command deck, the air was recycled and tasted of ozone and ancient oil. Jack Krauser sat in the Princeps throne, a seat designed for a human with neural jacks implanted in their spine. He had no such implants. He had the mutation. The flesh of his left arm had lost its cohesion, dissolving into a mass of fibrous tendrils that invaded the command console. The Las Plagas parasite, adaptable and aggressive, sought purchase within the cogitator banks of the super heavy tank. It found the machine spirit. The artificial intelligence of the Shadowsword was old, older than the hive city above it. It was a belligerent, slumbering beast that resented the intrusion. Krauser felt the resistance as a spike of white-hot pain in his frontal lobe. The machine screamed in binary denial. Krauser screamed back in biological dominance. He did not ask for control. He forced his nervous system into the tank's firing protocols. The tendrils of the mutation fused with the copper wiring, bridging the gap between flesh and adamantium. For a moment, Krauser forgot he was a man. He was 80 feet of armored plasteel. He was the volcano cannon. Outside the adamantium blast door, Lord Khorne of the World Eaters was cutting through the metal. The Terminator armored warlord used his lightning claws to shear through the gene lock mechanism. The door glowed cherry red, then white. It buckled. Khorne roared, a sound of triumph, expecting to find a trapped rat. The door fell inward. Khorne stepped into the breach, his retinal display scanning for the mercenary. He did not see a man. He saw the black barrel of a volcano cannon leveled directly at his chest. The Shadowsword fired. There was no sound at first, only the displacement of air as a laser beam the width of a train car ionized the atmosphere. The energy output was comparable to a small solar flare. Lord Khorne, a veteran of 10,000 years of war, a champion who had survived the siege of the Imperial Palace, was not defeated. He was erased. His Terminator armor, his flesh, his bones, and his pride were converted instantly into atomic ash. The beam did not stop there. It punched through the back wall of the vault. It punched through the rock of the subterranean foundation. It traveled for 3 miles through the planet's crust until the energy dissipated. The recoil of the weapon shook the entire depot complex. Dust rained down on the hull. Krauser, inside the tank, felt the discharge as an orgasmic release of tension. His heart rate synchronized with the reactor's cycling. He was not just piloting the tank. He was the tank. He drove the machine forward. The treads crushed the remains of the vault door. He crushed the ash that had been Khorne. He drove up the wide ramp intended for heavy haulers, the engine roaring with a deep subsonic bass that vibrated the teeth of every living thing within a kilometer. Krauser breached the surface. The night air was choked with smoke from the fires he had set. The World Eater's retinue, the Red Butchers, were waiting. They saw the Shadowsword emerge from the earth like a leviathan of old terror. They did not retreat. They were berserkers. They charged the tank with chain axes. It was a futile gesture. Krauser triggered the sponson-mounted heavy bolters. The mutation allowed him to target 12 independent threats simultaneously. The heavy bolters chugged rhythmically, turning the elite Chaos Terminators into sprays of red mist and scrap metal. He drove over the survivors. The Shadowsword did not negotiate. But the firing of the volcano cannon had done more than kill a warlord. The seismic shockwave had traveled deep, down into strata of the planet that the Imperium had ignored and the miners had feared. Deep beneath Antax Prime, something woke up. The first sign was the silence. The roar of the firestorm at the spaceport suddenly ceased, not because the fire went out, but because the oxygen feeding it was sucked away. A green luminescence began to bleed from the cracks in the ground. It was not the sick green of Nurgle's rot. It was a cold, electric emerald light. Krauser watched on the tank's Auspex screens. The ground radar was showing massive movement underground, not biological, tectonic. The earth in the center of the fuel depot collapsed. A monolith of black stone, smooth and oily, rose from the crater. It was a Necron pylon. It pulsed with a rhythm that was anti-life. The data slate in Krauser's mind, fed by the machine spirit, identified the threat signature. It was a pre-Imperial designation. Necron tier. The awakening had begun. Krauser realized the magnitude of his error. The vault had not been built to store the tank. The tank had been placed there to guard the tomb. By firing the main gun, he had rung the dinner bell for a dynasty that had been sleeping for 60 million years. Canoptek scarabs, millions of them, poured from the fissures like a metallic carpet. They swarmed over the burning wreckage of the World Eater's drop pods, breaking them down into energy. Then came the warriors. Phalanxes of metallic skeletons marched in perfect unison, their Gauss flares glowing green. The war for Antax Prime had just become a three-way extinction event. Krauser sat in the command throne. He had a choice. He could try to run. The Shadowsword had enough fuel to reach the southern wastes. He could hide there until the Necrons finished sterilizing the planet. But the voice in his head, the drumbeat of Khorne, was silent. It was replaced by a cold, calculating urge from the Las Plagas. The parasite knew that the Necrons were the ultimate enemy of all biological life. They offered no biomass. They offered no mutation. They were the end of the road. If Krauser wanted to survive, he had to be the warlord of the flesh. He keyed the external voxcaster of the tank. His voice, amplified to a thunderous volume, rolled over the battlefield. "Chaos filth," he bellowed. "The dead are awake. You die alone, or you fight for me." The surviving World Eaters, leaderless and confused by the sudden appearance of the Xenos, looked at the massive tank. They looked at the green tide of Necrons. In the logic of the 41st millennium, the enemy of my enemy is my meat shield. Krauser spun the Shadowsword around. He targeted the lead phalanx of Necron warriors. Fire, he thought. The tank fired. A massive high-explosive shell from the main gun obliterated 100 warriors. They did not scream. They simply shattered. But more were rising. Krauser began the fighting retreat. He was not retreating to hide. He was retreating to gather an army. He drove the Shadowsword through the ruins of Sector 4. He found the remnants of his scarred hand warband. They were engaged with a squad of Necron immortals. Krauser rolled the tank through the wall of the building. He crushed the immortals under the tracks. "Get on the hull," he ordered his men. "We are moving north." He picked up stragglers. He picked up leaderless blood pack squads. He even picked up a squad of terrified Imperial Guardsmen who had been cut off behind lines. He did not kill them. He needed guns. By dawn, Krauser was no longer just a tank commander. He was the head of a mechanized column of desperate survivors. He had 3 lemon rust tanks he had salvaged, a dozen chimeras, and 2,000 infantry hanging onto every available surface. They were heading for the Hive City. The Hive was under siege, but not by chaos. The Necrons had deployed a doomsday monolith. The massive floating pyramid was bombarding the Hive's void shields with particle whips. The Imperial defenders were dying in droves. Krauser's column arrived on the ridge overlooking the siege. He analyzed the tactical situation. The Necrons were focused on the city. Their rear was exposed. But attacking a monolith was suicide. Krauser felt the mutation pulse. The Las Plagas was changing him again. The interface with the tank was becoming permanent. His skin was turning grey and hard, resembling the ceramite of the hull. He could feel the fuel levels in his blood. He could taste the target data. He realized he could not win this with tactics. He needed to break the rules of warfare. He contacted the Hive City command frequency. "This is Jack Krauser," he transmitted. "I am the one who stole your tank." There was a pause, then a voice, shaken and weary. It was Colonel Holloway. "Krauser, you traitorous dog. I will see you hanged." "You are dead in an hour, Colonel," Krauser said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The Necrons will strip your atoms. I am offering you a chance. What do you want? Drop the void shields on the southern sector. Let me in. You want to bring a Chaos army into my city. I want to bring a Titan killer into range of that monolith. You drop the shield, I kill the pyramid, or you keep the shield up and we both die. Choose." The silence stretched for 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, the doomsday monolith fired again. The Hive's shield flickered and failed for a moment. "Shields dropping in Sector South 5, Holloway whispered. "May the Emperor have mercy on my soul." "He won't," Krauser said. He turned to his army. "Drive." The column charged down the ridge. The Necrons detected them. Scarab swarms turned to intercept. Krauser did not slow down. He used the Shadowsword as a battering ram. He plowed through the scarabs. The heavy bolters chugged. The troops on the hull fired their laser guns and autoguns. Men died. They were pulled off the tank by mechanical claws. They were disintegrated by Gauss fire. Krauser did not care. He had eyes only for the monolith. He breached the city perimeter. The streets were wide avenues, perfect for a super-heavy tank. The monolith loomed ahead. It was floating above the main plaza, a dark geometry that offended the eye. It turned toward him. The green crystal at its apex began to glow. Krauser pushed the reactor to 110%. The machine spirit screamed in warning. The heat in the cockpit was lethal. Krauser's skin blistered, but the mutation healed him instantly. He needed a clear shot at the central crystal. The monolith fired its particle whip. The beam hit the Shadowsword's front armor. The impact was like a hammer of the gods. The adamantium plating melted. The tank was thrown sideways, crushing a hab block. Inside, Krauser was thrown against the restraints. His vision went red. The systems were failing. "Main gun offline," the computer droned. Krauser laughed. He spat blood onto the console. "I am the gun," he growled. He channeled the bioenergy of the Las Plagas into the tank's capacitors. He fed his own life force into the weapon system. The mutation spread, covering the interior of the cockpit with pulsating flesh. He was jump-starting a god machine with his own soul. The volcano cannon hummed. It whined. It screamed. The monolith prepared to fire a second. Killing shot. Krauser fired first. The beam was not the clean blue of laser energy. It was tinged with violet, the color of the warp, the color of the parasite. It struck the monolith's central crystal. The alien geometry could not handle the chaotic infusion of energy. The crystal cracked. The monolith shuddered. It collapsed in on itself, imploding into a singularity of green light before exploding outward. The shockwave flattened the plaza. Krauser sat in the smoking ruin of the Shadowsword. He was alive. The tank was dead. The machine spirit had burned out, sacrificing itself for the shot. Krauser ripped the interface cables from his spine. He kicked open the hatch. He climbed out onto the hull. The city was burning. The Necrons were retreating, their command node destroyed. The Imperials were cheering. Krauser looked at his left arm. It was entirely consumed by the mutation now. It was a claw of bone and dark muscle, pulsing with heat. He looked up at the sky. The smoke parted. He saw something looking back. It wasn't a ship. It was an eye. A great red eye in the fabric of reality. Khorne had been watching. The blood god did not care about tactics. He did not care about tanks. He cared that one man, one mortal man, had walked into a meat grinder and broken the machine. The victory at Hive Tertius was not a salvation. It was a stay of execution. The destruction of the Necron monolith had disrupted the synchronization of the waking tomb world, causing the remaining Necron forces to default to defensive protocols. They withdrew to the pylon sites, establishing exclusion zones of absolute death. The Imperium held the Hive, but nothing else. The rest of the planet belonged to the dead. Jack Krauser walked through the smoke of the Victory Plaza. He was alone. His army of scavengers and opportunists had scattered to loot the dead or find shelter. The Imperial defenders, realizing that their savior was a mutant warlord, had trained their guns on him, but they had not fired. Fear held their trigger fingers. Colonel Holloway had given the order to let him pass. It was a professional courtesy between soldiers who knew the score. Krauser walked until he reached the edge of the crater where the monolith had fallen. The air here was thin, ionized. The silence was heavy. He felt the change in the atmosphere before he saw it. The gravity seemed to increase. The shadows lengthened and twisted, detaching themselves from the objects that cast them. The blood on his armor, layers of it from weeks of fighting, began to hiss and boil. He fell to his knees. The pain was absolute. It was not physical pain. It was the pain of his soul being stretched. The sky tore open. It was not a warp rift in the traditional sense. It was a window. Through the tear in reality, the brass citadel was visible. It was a fortress of impossible scale, surrounded by a moat of boiling blood. Skulls were piled high as mountains. A presence descended. It did not have a form that the human mind could fully comprehend. It was a pressure. It was the concept of violence made manifest. Khorne did not speak. Khorne does not negotiate. The blood god simply projected a truth into Krauser's mind. You are mine. The offer was simple. Krauser was dying. The Las Plagas mutation was aggressive. Without the suppression drugs of his home world, it would consume his brain within days, turning him into a mindless beast. The stress of the Shadowsword interface had accelerated the process. He had burned his candle at both ends. Khorne offered a solution. Ascension. If Krauser accepted, the mutation would be stabilized. He would be granted a demonhood of a specific, rare caste. He would not be a mindless berserker. He would be a marshal of the skull. He would be a generic of the eternal war, granted command over legions of demons to wage campaigns across the stars forever. He would never die. He would never be weak. He would never be betrayed by a bureaucracy again. All he had to do was surrender his will. He had to acknowledge that he was a tool. Krauser looked at his mutated hand. He flexed the claws. He looked at the red eye in the sky. I am not a tool, Krauser said. His voice was a rasp, barely audible against the roaring wind of the warp. The pressure increased. The ground cracked. The refusal was an insult. The blood god could crush him like an insect. I'm a soldier, Krauser said, standing up against the crushing gravity. I fight for a paycheck. I fight for a goal. If I belong to you, I have no goal. I am just a weapon in a rack. He looked directly into the warp. I will give you blood, Krauser shouted. I will give you skulls. I will give you wars that make this planet look like a skirmish. But I do it on my terms. I am the contractor. You are the client. It was an insanity. A mortal dictating terms to a chaos god. But Khorne is also the god of martial pride. He despises cowards, But he respects audacity. He respects the warrior who refuses to kneel, even when the blade is at his throat. The pressure shifted. It changed from crushing weight to a searing heat. Khorne accepted the counteroffer. It was not demonhood. It was something else. It was a mark of the Slayer. A bolt of red lightning struck Krauser. It did not kill him. It burned the mutation. It cauterized the Las Plagas, fusing the alien biology with Krauser's own genetic code. The parasite was no longer a separate entity. It was fully integrated. The pain vanished. The fatigue vanished. Krauser stood in the crater. His armor had fused to his skin. The World Eater plates were now part of his body, a carapace of crimson and black. His face was scarred, his eyes burning with an inner fire that was not yellow, but a deep blood red. He was not a demon prince. He was a mortal champion, a status of independent command. The rift in the sky closed. The transaction was complete. Krauser turned away from the crater. He had work to do. The Imperium was preparing to exterminatus the planet. He knew the signs. The high-altitude bombers were retreating. The fleet in orbit was moving into position. They would burn Antax Prime to ash to stop the Necron awakening. Krauser had to get off-world. He walked back to the Shadowsword wreckage. He found the Voxcaster. It was damaged but functional. He broadcasted on a wide frequency. Not to the Imperials, to the Void. "This is the scarred hand," he said. "We have the coordinates of the Mechanicus Archaeotech vault. We have the codes. We are leaving. Any ship that wants the loot, come and get us. The payment is passage." It was a gamble. But the galaxy is full of corsairs, renegades, and traitors. 3 hours later, a red corsair strike cruiser broke orbit and descended. They were pirates, scum of the galaxy. They ignored the Imperial blockade, using the magnetic interference of the Necron pylons to mask their approach. They landed in the plaza. Krauser walked up the ramp. He was followed by 50 of his best men, the survivors of the original PDF, the blood-packed defectors, the killers he had forged in the fire. The Corsair captain, a twisted Astartes with a bionic eye, looked at Krauser. He saw the mark of Khorne. He saw the living armor. He felt the aura of violence. "You are the one the Vox speaks of?" the captain asked. "The tank killer." "I am Krauser," he said. "And the loot?" Krauser handed him a data slate. It contained the map to the vault, the location of the other dormant Necron tombs, and the codes to the planetary defense grid. It was enough intelligence to sell for a fortune, or to doom the sector. "Payment delivered," Krauser said. "Take us to the Maelstrom." The ship lifted off. As they ascended, Krauser looked out the viewport. He saw the Imperial fleet open fire. Cyclonic torpedoes struck the surface of Antax Prime. The atmosphere ignited. The oceans boiled. The Hive City, the Necrons, the corpses of his enemies. All of it was consumed in a firestorm that cracked the planet to its core. He felt no sadness. He felt no regret. He touched the cold glass. The reflection stared back at him. He was a monster now by every definition of the human race. But he was a free monster. He had survived the crash. He had survived the experiments. He had survived the Imperium. He had survived the Necrons. He had survived a god. He turned to his men. They were cleaning their weapons, strapping themselves into the drop seats of the Thunderhawk Bay. They looked at him with absolute loyalty. "Where to, Commander?" Vess asked. Krauser smiled. It was the smile of a man who had found his place in the universe. "There is a war in the Kadia sector," Krauser said. "Big contracts, lots of targets." He sat down and began to sharpen his knife. It was the same knife he had arrived with, but the steel was now dark, imbued with the warp energy of his kills. "We have a schedule to keep." The orbital bombardment of Antax Prime ceased 40 hours after the escape of the Red Corsair vessel. The planet was no longer a strategic asset or a habitable world. It was a sphere of cooling glass and fractured tectonic plates, the atmosphere stripped away by cyclonic torpedoes to ensure the Necron tomb complex remained buried forever. The Imperial Guard regiments that had held the line were ash. The history of the Hive City was erased. The Departamento Munitorum filed the loss under natural disaster and Xenos intervention, burying the reality of the conflict under mountains of bureaucracy. On the bridge of the black ship Eterna, Inquisitor Haldane sat in the dark viewing room. The only light came from the flickering hololith table. He was watching a recovered data stream from a destroyed Valkyrie gunship that had been flying over the southern plaza in the final moments. The image was grainy, distorted by the radiation of the Shadowsword's reactor and the warp residue of the opening rift. It showed the super heavy tank, a holy relic of Mars, glowing with a corrupt violet energy. It showed the doomsday monolith shattering, and it showed the man standing on the hull of the ruin. He did not look like the raving berserkers of the World Eaters, foaming at the mouth and screaming for skulls. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the sky with a terrifying calmness. He looked like a professional. Haldane paused the image. He zoomed in on the subject's face. The scars were deep. The skin was fused with the red ceramite of the stolen armor. The left arm was a nightmare of biological engineering and warped flesh. But the eyes were what paused the Inquisitor's hand. They were burning red, yet they possessed a cold intelligence. The Inquisitor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's air cycling. The Imperium could fight monsters. It had billions of soldiers to throw into the meat grinder against demons and aliens. The Imperium survived because its enemies were often insane, disorganized, or driven by instincts that could be predicted. But this was something else. This was a man who treated the Long War not as a religion, but as a career. The report on Haldane's desk was stamped with the highest level of secrecy. It detailed the escape of the Red Corsair strike cruiser. It listed the stolen assets, planetary defense codes, star charts of dormant Necron worlds, archaeotech schematics, and one human soul. The report gave the subject a designation, the mercenary of brass. Haldane knew the danger of this specific heresy. It was not the corruption of the flesh. It was the corruption of the soldier's duty. If the trillions of downtrodden guardsmen learned that a man could reject the Emperor, negotiate with the ruinous powers, and keep his sanity while gaining power, the morale of the Astra Militarum would crack. He authorized the transmission of a cryptic kill order to the Officio Assassinorum. He requested a Vindicar sniper. He did not expect it to succeed. Men like Jack Krauser did not die in the dark. They died on mountains of corpses, or not at all. Deep within the maelstrom, inside the warp storm that bled into reality, the Corsair strike cruiser drifted through the purple currents of the Empyrean. Inside the ship's armory, the air smelled of recycled sweat and gun oil. Jack Krauser sat on a bench. He was cleaning the blade of his combat knife. The steel had changed. It was darker now, drinking the light of the room. It hummed with a low vibration when he touched it. He checked the edge. It was perfect. He looked at the tactical display on the wall. The galaxy was burning. The Black Crusade was gathering strength. The Tyranids were consuming the east. The Necrons were waking in the south. Most men would see the end of the world. Krauser saw a target-rich environment. He sheathed the knife. He stood up and walked toward the drop bay, where his new army was waiting. The war for Antax Prime was over. The war for the galaxy was just another contract, and he was ready to work.